This was not meant to happen. George Galloway, the new MP for Bradford West. And just hours earlier, the looks on the faces from Labour said it all. They knew the numbers were not adding up.
And I do hereby declare that George Galloway is duly elected.
Good evening. It's Goodnight with George Galloway. I'm sorry I'm smoking again. It's one of my New Year resolutions to kick this habit. But it's a more relaxed podcast that we're going to do this evening, looking back at 2012 and looking forward to 2013. 2012 was, in short, the most remarkable year of my life, which has not been uneventful. I started 2012 as an you could say, retired member of Parliament. I have ended 2012 having scored the most sensational British by-election result in history, and I'm ready to adumbrate the exceptional character of that result later in the broadcast. Not only that, I got married, and not only once but 3 times, all to the same woman, of course, in Amsterdam, in Jakarta, and here in London in Parliament. So that's got to count as a pretty special year for me personally. But of course it has been an eventful year around the world, as they all are. There has been war, famine, pestilence and disease. There has been injustice, and there has been victories as well as defeats. Some of those victories are really standout victories that I shall dilate upon because I was there, like the victory of President Hugo Chavez, for example, just a few months ago, triumphing against the might of the American-backed oligarchy and opposition in Venezuela once again, defeating everything that was thrown at him, except perhaps ill health, and we'll come to that later too. So this is a kind of almanac, you might say, the broadcast equivalent of the kind of annual that used to be bought at Christmas time when I was young, reviewing the year perhaps and looking forward to the next. Let's start with the Bradford by-election. I remember sitting in this very room tweeting the following words: a parliamentary by-election in the Bradford West constituency. It seemed an inauspicious thing to do. I was contacted immediately by some of my very closest friends and allies, who told me in no uncertain terms that I definitely should not stand in the Bradford West parliamentary by-election. In fact, one of them told me I would struggle to hold my deposit. famous last words. Well, I knew that there was a real base for us in Bradford, because in all of the preceding decade, people from Bradford had been right at the front of all the great battles that I had fought. When we had these magnificent anti-war marches 10 years ago, which drew people in their millions at the height and hundreds of thousands even at the middle, the people of Bradford were always there in very significant numbers. And I would, by chance, kismet, destiny, or whatever, always seem to run into the prominent figures in Bradford. I knew from the convoys that we had run to break the siege on Gaza, time after time after time over these last few years, I knew that the Bradford contingent on these convoys was always the biggest contingent, the most militant, the most committed to getting through, and the most creative when it came to arguing with the forces of the various dictatorships through which we had to pass to make sure that all the goods that they were bringing on board for the besieged Palestinian people in Gaza actually got through to the place and the people that they were intended to. So as soon as the now late Marsha Singh MP announced that he was standing down for health reasons, I tweeted, a by-election in Bradford West? But in my mind I was already off and running, whatever my friends said. In fact, I must tell you, I was the only person, the only one, who thought that it was a good idea for me to throw my hat into the ring in the Bradford by-election. And I include family and friends. But I was in the car a day or two later with a long-standing colleague, now my Chief of Staff, Rob Hoveman, and I asked him, "How are you feeling, Rob?" as we buckled up and set off on the long drive to the north. He said, "Trepidatious," which is a very fine old English word, an Oxford word. He's an Oxford Blue. Trepidatious. He was anxious. And when we arrived in Bradford, we hooked up with our 2 members in the city. That's 2 members in the city. So now we were 4. And just 20 days later, we were not 4, we were not 400, but we were numbered in the thousands. In the thousands of active participants in the by-election. The incredible phenomenon that was the Bradford West by-election has been poorly charted, partly because the media was asleep, which may or may not have been a good thing for me, but they clearly had absolutely no inkling at all that I was going to win the election, because they didn't come. And so there's very little footage and almost no coverage in the national press about that historic by-election campaign. So there's only what we managed to photograph, what we managed to video, and what we will always remember. We had no office, no money, and 4 members, including me and my Chief of Staff. And from that little acorn, this great oak grew in such record quick time. Labour had called the by-election in record quick time because they imagined that it would be a walk in the park, and they wanted to get on with the business of pretending to oppose the Conservative Liberal coalition government, but not really. They naturally imagined that nobody else could win in Bradford. Conservatives couldn't win, the Liberals couldn't win, Liberals couldn't beat an egg nowadays. So they thought it would be easy, which is why they chose a chump, a big baluka, Imran Hussain, a barrister, most unlikely barrister. I wouldn't want him in my corner representing me if I was ever in trouble. I can assure you of that. And if you take a look at him on YouTube, you wouldn't hire him either. Imran Hussain thought he only had to turn up to win. In fact, I can tell you that he'd even booked a victory celebration here in London through legal business partners who had already secured a venue and paid a deposit upon it. They thought that the hard part was being chosen as the Labour candidate, that the election itself was a foregone conclusion. But they were quickly disabused of that, because our four didn't become thousands overnight, but it grew exponentially. And thanks to a local legal firm, Chamber Solicitors, we had quite a big space that we were able to utilize in the evenings at close of campaigning. And this big space, before very long, was bulging at the seams, and people were massing outside. And those that were trying to provide tea and coffee to the multitudes soon found that it was a losing game. It was simply impossible to keep up with the number of people who had joined our campaign. People of all kinds, men and women, black and white, Muslim, non-Muslim, young and old. But of them all, the most important were the young. And of those, the most important were the young women. We had, in our election campaign, more young women campaigners than I have ever seen in any political campaign. It was really something to behold. Young women in Bradford who had never been involved in politics before. Young women whose father-in-laws very often had told them that they were committed to voting Labour, either because of simple history or because of the system known as brotherlyism, whereby you're expected to vote for somebody because his father came from the same village as your father back in Mirpur 60 years ago. Get that for democracy. But these young women and men were determined that they were not going to vote as other people told them to vote. Here they had a choice. They had a choice between somebody who self-evidently could do the job and someone who self-evidently could not. Someone whose election would make no difference at all, and someone whose election would make a very great deal of difference, a very great deal of noise, and would be noticed not just around this country, but would be noticed around the world. These young people and the others who joined us had, by the virtue of Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and all the other means now at our disposal in this world, known actually quite a lot about my political record, my speeches in Parliament, and great anti-war demonstrations, my famous altercations on the BBC, on Sky, with the US Senate and so on. So actually I was meeting people that I didn't know but who knew me very well indeed. This campaign, as it grew bigger and bigger, grew more and more flamboyant. We had an open-top bus, we had not one ad trailer, but I think in the end, on the last day, we might have had 4 ad vans, gigantic, mobile posters. We had hundreds of people on motorbikes, trailing Respect banners. We had the most expensive motor cars you've ever seen. We had people in Rolls Royces and Lamborghinis sporting Vote George Galloway posters. It wasn't good for my green credentials, but I'll tell you this, it didn't have warmed the heart. Unknown to everybody else, I had actually undertaken to get married a week before polling day. Such were my expectations at the beginning of the campaign, I didn't even actually bother to postpone the wedding day until it became obvious that actually slipping away to get married a week before the election, when I was now in with a very real chance of winning this election, wasn't a good idea. Luckily my wife saw the sense of that right away, and we rescheduled it for the day after the by-election, still not imagining that this Everest, this apparently impossible feat, surely could be won. But it was. It was the biggest swing recorded in a by-election in England, in Britain actually, for 70 years. It was the biggest fourth party election victory ever. It was only the second time in the whole history of the country that a party to the left of Labour had captured a seat in a parliamentary election, and the first time was me also, when Respect captured the Bethnal Green and Bow seat. So it was history all round. It was remarkable because we were taking a seat off Labour when the Tories were in power, and at the end of the Tories' worst ever week. At least it was their worst ever week at that time. Unfortunately for the country, they've had many more worst ever weeks. So it was a truly phenomenal result. That word is perhaps overused, but phenomenal is our reading of it, and any dispassionate, objective person would have to agree. Anyway, it was the fourth parliamentary seat that I had won in 6 election victories in 2 countries, England and Scotland, an honour of which I'm proud, and one that I share with only one other person, and that's Winston Churchill, which is not a bad record to have. So the first thing I need to do in reviewing the year and reliving those memories is to thank all the people who worked in the Bradford West by-election, because without them I'd have just been shouting into the wind. Without the people who took the message door to door, street to street, house to house, workplace to workplace, without the people who gave us the ad vans and the open top buses and the office space, the meeting space, without the guys on the motorcycles, without the guys in the Lamborghinis and all the other cars in our cavalcades, without the men and women who made this great victory possible, I would be talking to you at the end of this year in a very different vein. As it is, I'm talking to you again as a member of the British Parliament now for 25 years, 6 election victories. I've come back to the House of Commons when nobody expected me to, just as the people of Bethnal Green and Bow in 2005, after Tony Blair had expelled me at the end of the Iraq War, picked me up and put my feet back on the higher ground. So, above all, I want to thank the voters of Bradford West for paying me the signal honour and privilege of sending me to Parliament on their behalf, to raise my voice on their behalf, to be a voice for them when they have been so dismally let down, betrayed even by the political class that purports to represent them. I'll never forget the people of Bradford West. I'll never forget that by-election. And you know what? Neither will New Labour. They'll never again put up a big palooka. They'll never again put up a stiff, imagining that it will be a walk in the park. They'll have to be on their mettle if they're going to win this seat of Bradford West back again. Defending a 10,000 majority, me, it's going to take some doing. And New Labour will have to choose somebody pretty good to fight us then. Anyway, I did win, and then I stole away the very next day to Amsterdam, still in my battle clothes, still needing a shave. A few pounds lighter than I was at the start of the campaign, and that's a weight loss that has continued, and I'm very happy about that. It's another of my New Year resolutions: give up the cigars, lose that extra last few pounds. And I came back to England the day after the wedding to discover it had become a bit of a newsworthy item. So, electorally, it was a very good year for Respect. We tripled in size in the weeks after the by-election. We simply couldn't keep up, couldn't administer the number of people who joined us. And that's actually an increase in membership that has continued as we closed 2012. We're getting on for 4 times the size that we were before the Bradford West by-election. So nothing succeeds like success. Nothing draws people towards a political organisation than the sense that it's moving forward, than the sense that it's challenging for further victories and opposing the things that are wrong in our society. Some of those I'll tell you about right after this.
This was not meant to happen. George Galloway, the new MP for Bradford West. And just hours earlier, the looks on the faces from Labour said it all. They knew the numbers were not adding up.
And I do hereby declare that George Galloway is duly elected.
He won with a staggering 10,000 majority, and he gave a winner's speech to match.
This, the most sensational result in British by-election history, bar none, represents the Bradford Spring.
A changing of the seasons at Labour's expense. They thought they'd win here. Today the inquest into why they didn't began.
It was an incredibly disappointing result for Labour in Bradford West, and I am determined that we learn the lessons of what happened. And I'm going to lead that. I'm going to be going back to the constituency in the coming weeks to talk to people there about why this result happened.
The Liberal Democrats got just over 1,000 votes. The Conservatives came third, but said Bradford West was Labour territory.
This was more or less a kind of a comfortable win for the Labour Party, and they completely messed it up. And I think Ed Miliband needs to take a serious look at his leadership.
George Galloway is not your average politician. He was expelled from Labour in 2003. He had an audience with Saddam Hussein, and there was the confrontation with US senators. But what happened here in Bradford? Yes, he ran a great PR campaign, and George Galloway was ever present in this city. But more than that, he knew his audience and he knew what to say to them.
Well, those soldiers have already been withdrawn from Afghanistan.
His message was anti-war. Who did you vote for?
George Galloway. It's not just the people of Afghanistan who are losing their lives, it's British blood that's been spilled. And it seems as though the government just doesn't value the blood of British soldiers.
And then there were those who wanted to send a message to the main 3 parties.
I voted for George Galloway.
What did he offer you?
He's a very charismatic chap, and he seems to make sense when he speaks.
They say George Galloway is a one-off. Some politicians hope the same can be said for this by-election. Ed Thomas, BBC News, Bradford.
The backdrop to the year, as most years, certainly of my lifetime, has been the continued turmoil, carnage in the Middle East. In the Arab Middle East, there have been long decades in which I have been involved in the struggle against Arab dictators on the one hand and the struggle for the return of the Palestinian people on the other. It's not been easy having to deal with an Arab world that was so unattractive to the eyes of just about everybody. An Arab world ruled almost without exception from the Atlantic to the Gulf by dictators, some of them the most grotesque individuals wielding power anywhere on the planet. Fantastically wealthy, wasting their country's billions on weapons that they couldn't use, had no intention of using except against their own people to stay in power. spending their country's billions in the casinos, the bordellos, the property markets, the stock markets of the very Western countries, with whom they had entered a Faustian pact with the devil. The West would keep the dictator in power, and the dictator would undertake not only to generally toe the line of the big powers' foreign policies, but to recycle the petrodollars that they had earned through Western economies and banked with Western financial institutions. That's why a place like Marbella, for example, can be a kind of Saudi town with undreamt of riches invested and spent in it, whilst equally beautiful places in Morocco just across the narrow Mediterranean are entirely undeveloped. And if the Saudis and other Gulfies would spend their money in Morocco, then the Moroccan people would be a lot better off than they are today. I've always had to struggle with this strange dichotomy. I was with the Arabs, but against their regimes. I was against Israel, the European settler state, but not with the transformation of that into any old Arab polity, because nobody could find that an attractive proposition. But since the last 2 years, there has been revolution in the air in the Arab world. I'm one of those who believes that the Arab Revolution is a genuine revolution. It represents a throwing off, an intifada, throwing off the shackles of brute dictatorship. But I always made 2 points. One, that revolution was a process, not an event, and that the French Revolution took a decade, the Bolshevik Revolution half a decade or more in order to be completed. And the Arab Revolution is definitely not going to be different to that. The mere flight of the tyrant, usually clutching such of his ill-gotten gains that he can carry, is not the end of a revolution, but the beginning of a revolution. The tyrant has gone, the tyranny can remain, and the system which the tyrant had built up, the comprador upon which the tyrant rested, the ways, apparatus with which the dictator wielded absolute power, can oftentimes still be in place even when the tyrant has gone. And a fight back from those interests can never be entirely ruled out. In any case, I'm a great believer in the French revolutionary slogan that those who half make a revolution are digging their own graves. You either have to have a revolution or not. You can't do it halfway, just as you can't be a little bit pregnant. You can't have half a revolution, because if you do, the tyranny will be back and vengeance will be terrible. The Tunisian revolution threw up a landslide election victory for Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi and his Ennahda party, which is the main party in Tunisian politics today, although it's in very difficult times. It's facing a rather odd coalition, one which we shall see later in relation to the Egyptian revolution. But Ennahda and Sheikh Rashid are facing now a war of attrition against a weird coalition of the elements of the old regime, the Falul, the remnants of the old regime of Zainabdin Ben Ali, former traffic cop who became tyrant of Tunisia, and left and progressive people who so hate Islam, or at least its political expression, that they are ready to link up with the forces of the old dictatorship to defeat the democratically elected Islamic party, Ennahda. And Sheikh Rashid actually has not had the opportunity, I hope it's a lack of opportunity, to practice what he had long preached here in England and had developed, one of the reasons I found him such an attractive figure and was so close to him during his 20 years of exile in London, was that he had attempted to synthesize the red and the green, to synthesize revolutionary, progressive politics with the politics of Islam and Islamism. He's not had much of a chance to put that into practice. He's made some mistakes, and now he's in very difficult trouble. And I wish him well and hope that 2013 is a good year for him. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood has had almost as difficult a time. The Muslim Brotherhood won, first of all, a landslide parliamentary majority, together with the Salafists, who came out of nowhere and who are ostensibly, on the face of it, more Islamist than the Muslim Brotherhood. Together they won 75% of the seats in the Egyptian parliament. The Muslim Brotherhood itself winning 50% of the seats, the Salafists winning 25%, and other independent Islamist candidates also winning. Then it came to the presidential election some months later, and although I did not myself support the Muslim Brotherhood presidential candidate, Dr. Morsi, I supported Dr. Abdel Fattah and other candidates who were standing in that election. When it came to the final ballot between the Muslim Brotherhood and the remnants of the old Mubarak dictatorship, the Falul candidate, there was only one choice for me, and that was the Muslim Brotherhood. And I encouraged people on my television shows and radio programs and in writing on Facebook and Twitter and so on to vote for Dr. Morsi. Not because I loved him, I don't. Not because I love the Muslim Brotherhood, neither in Egypt nor anywhere else, I don't. But because if it's a choice between the Islamic forces and the old dictatorship, then I have to be with the Islamic forces. I wish that Hamdin Sabahi, the veteran Nasserist left-wing politician, could have won the presidency of Egypt. As it was, he did very, very well, gaining, I think, 3 million votes, which, considering he had absolutely no money and had spent the preceding 25 years as a kind of outlaw in Egypt, was a great triumph, but not at the races so far as winning the presidency itself is concerned. And then President Morsi introduced a new constitution, and he took some powers temporarily, which were intended to see the government through until the constitution was endorsed. I supported him on that also because the judges in Egypt are the judges of the Mubarak era, the judges of the dictatorship, and they could not be allowed to thwart the democratic will of the Egyptian people that had been expressed first through a revolution which overthrew the tyrant, and then in an election which the Islamic parties very clearly won. So I supported him on that, and all hell broke loose. There was mayhem on the streets of Alexandria and Cairo and elsewhere. And again we saw the emergence of this weird coalition, the kind that's facing up to Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia. A kind of weird amalgam between left and progressive and liberal forces and the forces of the old dictatorship. And again, I'm afraid in any confrontation like that, I'm with the Islamic forces, and so should the progressive people in Egypt be. It would make for a much better form of political Islam if the left was engaged with it rather than on the streets in confrontation with it. We'll come to Palestine in a minute, but the other very, very, very big story of unbelievable bloodiness and tragedy is the civil war raging in Syria, which looks likely to rage for many years to come. Lakhdar Brahimi, the UN Special Envoy, Kofi Annan having given up in despair, predicted that there could be 100,000 dead in Syria, that Syria could become Somalia. And that, given where Syria is, given what Syria is, it really is a nightmare prospect. And I'll discuss it in depth after this. The Syrian imbroglio, of course, has become the bloodiest of the lot, the most intractable of the lot, and the most difficult for some, it would appear, to see clearly through the fog of war and war propaganda. Let me lay my cards on the table, as I always do on these broadcasts. Almost 400,000 people have watched these broadcasts since July, so there's clearly an appetite for them, and I hope that being honest is the principal reason for the success of the podcasts. So let me be absolutely honest here in a way that will please nobody and upset everybody. I'm not with Bashar al-Assad, and I never have been. In fact, historically, in the split between Syria and Iraq, I would have been on Iraq's side. In relationship to the dictatorship in Syria, I have had historically no relations at all. Scarcely been there. I owe them nothing. In fact, they owe me. I still have 2 airline tickets for attendance at conferences in Syria that were supposed to be reimbursed by the Syrian regime, which have not been. So nothing that I'm about to say has anything to do either with personal relations or any other kind of relations with the Syrian regime, or any sectarian consideration whatsoever. Oftentimes, people who are disappointed in my take on Syria imagine that it's because I'm a Shiite. I am not a Shiite, and I have absolutely no plans to become one. My stand is with the Syrian people in their just demands for freedom and democracy and progress, and with the Syrian people's demand to be able to freely elect their government and remove it when it no longer is fit for purpose from their point of view. I'm very clear about that, and I have been right from the beginning. As a matter of fact, right after the Tunisian revolution, I told Bashar al-Assad personally that he should now call a free and fair presidential election, and moreover that if he did, he'd almost certainly win it, and thus be the only Arab leader in the entire Arab world that had been freely chosen by their people. Advice which he seemed to be impressed by, but didn't take, at least didn't follow it. So I'm with the Syrian people in their just demands. The Syrian people are as entitled to rise up and overthrow their government as any other people. And given that they've had one family rule for more than 40 years, perhaps more reason than most so to do. But there are 2 things I can't accept about what has become known as the Syrian Revolution. The first is its self-evidently, blindingly obvious sectarian character. Syria is a sophisticated, multicultural, multi-faith, advanced society. It's not a backwoods. Neither is any religious grouping hegemonic there. For a start, there are many Christians in Syria who have always, even under this dictatorship of the last 40 years, have always been protected and honored as anybody who's ever visited a monastery or a nunnery or a cathedral or a church, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Maronite church in Syria knows that Christian people in Syria have been protected as ancient Christians from the Holy Land itself. There are 27 religious minorities in Syria, none of which are ready to be ruled by Al-Qaeda, none of which are ready to look like Afghanistan, none of which are ready to accept some sub-Osama bin Laden emerging as a warlord, a warrior chief, ruling in his own interpretation of Sharia over them. They're not prepared to accept it. Not only are there 27 religious minorities in Syria, there are also ethnic minorities. There are Druze people there, there are Kurdish people there, as well as Arabs. Of course, the majority of the people in the country are Sunni. The majority of the Arabs in the country are Sunni. But the majority of those equally have no taste whatsoever for Al-Qaeda or Taliban type interpretations of Islam. Syria isn't Afghanistan. It isn't Saudi Arabia, and it never will agree to be so. Yet the character of the so-called revolution in Syria has become more and more ugly in its sectarian outlook, murdering Shiites, Alawites, Christians, murdering Kurdish people, all in the name of the kind of Al-Qaeda mentality which was exported to Afghanistan in the 1980s and which has manifested itself many places since, including of course in Libya as we speak. And the second thing I cannot accept, and you have to understand where I'm coming from, I have spent all of my entire life opposing Western colonialism and the Zionist state, and the idea that I could support a revolution that is principally armed, financed and supported by Western colonialism and the Zionist state. It's clearly absurd, ridiculous. If this Syrian revolution was a good thing, why would America and Britain be supporting it? If this Syrian revolution looked like a real good thing for the Arabs, for the people of Syria, why would Israel be supporting it? Think. It's precisely because it is not a good thing, that its character is the exact opposite of what is required, that Britain and America and France and Israel and their dummies, their satraps, their slaves in what they call Saudi Arabia and what's the other one, the petrol station masquerading as a country, Qatar and others. The West is using these puppets, money, to fuel an Al-Qaeda inspired sectarian civil war in Syria. Why? Because they think it's going to be good for Syria? Because they think it's going to be good for the Arabs? Good for the Palestinians? Are they doing it because they think it will be bad for Israel? Don't be ridiculous. 1 minute's appreciation of that situation shows that in this very difficult conundrum, there's only one thing to do, and that is to continue patiently to argue for negotiation and transition by peaceful democratic means to democracy in Syria. It may not work, maybe it's too late, maybe the Syrian regime will fall, but I will never regret the stand that I have taken, which is not a simple one. It's not black and white, it's not sloganizing, it's not either with this or with that. I'm actually not with either of the two sides in the Syrian civil war. It's not that I like Bashar, it's that I dislike his enemies. It's not that I think Bashar is good, it's that I think Bashar is less bad than his enemies. And that's unfortunately where we've got to in the Syrian tragedy. As we speak, videos emerge of these so-called jihadists cutting off the heads of prisoners, helpless and bound, that they have taken. In one video, these so-called jihadists got children to cut off the heads of helpless prisoners and videoed it. Can you believe it? They videoed it, and it's now available on YouTube. Small children cutting off people's heads. Well, they have lost their minds if they think that the Syrian people, this proud heartland of Arabism, this outpost of learning and civilization and sophistication, is ever going to go quietly into that good night. So even if Bashar did fall, even if the Syrian regime did fall, that, I'm afraid, would be merely the beginning and not in any sense the end of the matter. One of the reasons why Israel, Britain, America and France hate the Syrian regime is because the Syrian regime has always supported the Palestinian resistance and continues to do so even today as it clings on for dear life. The Syrian regime is hated by the Crusaders and the Zionists because of its relations with Hezbollah, the Lebanese national resistance, the only Arab fighting force ever to defeat Israel on the battlefield. The Syrian regime is hated by the Crusaders and the Zionists because of its relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is the big enchilada, which is the big target for this Crusader Zionist alliance, axis of wickedness and axis of everything that will be bad for the Muslim world, everything that will be bad for the Arabs. So, as I've said many times before, Bashar is hated not for the bad things about him, of which there are many. The Syrian regime is not hated for the bad things about them, of which there are many. They are hated for the good things. They're hated because they have never surrendered to Israel and the Crusaders. They have never agreed to break their relations with the resistance and with the Palestinian resistance first and foremost. Who knows what will happen in the coming year in Syria? The outlook looks very bleak. A kind of Somalia, as an outcome, will be pregnant with problems for everybody, including the people who gave these jihadists their guns and their money to begin with. It is one of the truly extraordinary phenomenon of our age that the United States of America, that was attacked so cruelly on 9/11, 2001, which lost thousands of its own people at the hands of adherents of the Bin Laden Al-Qaeda worldview, that same United States of America is today arming and financing Al-Qaeda in Syria. Don't take my word for that. Consult the New York Times. Consult the US State Department. They openly discuss the growing presence of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And we are supporting them, just as we did when we set up these people in the first place in the 1980s to attack, invade, and ultimately triumph in Afghanistan. I mentioned the Palestinian people. For them, it's been another tough year, and I'll deal with that just after this.
Just before sundown on the 14th of November, Israel broke a ceasefire that had been adhered to by Palestinian resistance groups. It launched a premeditated land, sea and air assault on the besieged Gaza Strip, named Operation Pillar of Cloud. During the 8-day war, rocket fire from Gazan resistance groups killed 1 Israeli soldier and 5 civilians. In all, 1,404 Palestinians were injured, overwhelmingly women and children. 174 Gazans were killed, including 3 journalists, 1 medic, 1 rescue worker, 12 elderly persons, 10 women, 59 children. May they all rest in peace.
Isam Mahmoud Abu Ma'za, 20 years old. Muhammad Hani Kseh, 18 years old. Rani Mahmoud Hamad, 29 years old. Khalid Abdurrahman Abu Nasser, 27 years old. Muhammad Talal Salman, 27 years old. Bilal Mhasin Al-Barbarawi, 21 years old. Yahya Akram Ma'roof, 20 years old. Abdurrahman Mustafa Hamad, 31 years old. Ayman Rafiq Abu Rashid, 29 years old.
سهيلة محمود ياسين الدلو, 73 years old. أمنية مطر حسان المزنر, 75 years old. سعدية محمد العايدي ديب, 62 years old.
تهاني حسن الدلو, 52 years old. نوال فرج السوسي, 53 years old.
Mustafa Awad Abu Hamidan, 23 years old. Muhammad Adnan Al-Ashqar, 22 years old. Ayman Talal Al-Asali, 18 years old. Ibrahim Hassan Shahada, 22 years old. Fadi Musa Al-Qattani, 28 years old. Muhammad Ramadan Shamallah, 24 years old. Amir Mahmoud Al-Dadda, 29 years old. Mahmoud Muhammad Al-Zuhairi, 21 years old. Ahmad Jamil Dogmosh, 13 years old. Subhi Nimr Dogmosh, 29 years old. Oda Arafat Shindi, 18 years old. Faris Mansour Isbite, 25 years old. Abdurrahman Ayash, 32 years old. Muhammad Bakr, 27 years old. Muhammad Jamal Al-Dalu, 29 years old. Judah Sulaiman Shamallah, 31 years old. Amjad Muhammad Abu Jalal, 33 years old. Ziyad Farahat Sulaiman Abu Jalal, 23 years old. Hassan Salim Al-Hmela, 27 years old. Ramiz Najib Deeb Harb, 34 years old. Salim Aish Abu Sitta, 22 years old.
محمود محمد أبو صواوين, 61 years old. أحمد سالم بن سعيد, 60 years old. إبراهيم محمود نصر أبو نصر, 80 years old. أحمد سليمان ربيع أبو نقيرة, 61 years old.
مروان عبد الرحمن محمد أبو القمصان, 52 years old. سهيل عاشور محمد حمادة, 42 years old. جلال محمد صالح نصر, 36 years old. العبد محمد العبد العطار, 50 years old. فؤاد خليل محمد حجازي, 46 years old.
Khalid Khalil Al-Shari, 25 years old. Ali Abdul Halim Al-Manama, 24 years old. Usama Musa Abdul Jawad, 27 years old. Ashraf Hassan Darwish, 22 years old. Ali Hassan bin Saeed, 25 years old. Muhammad Sabri Al-Awedat, 31 years old. Hani Abdul Majid Brema, 31 years old.
Jumana Salama Ibrahim Saifan, 2 years old. Runan Yusuf Jalal Arafat, 3 years old. Hanin Khalid Ahmad Tafish, 10 months old.
Ahmad Awad Mahmoud Abu Aliyan, 14 years old. Umar Mahmoud Ibrahim Al-Astal, 14 years old. Walid Mahmoud Al-Abadla, 2 years old. Nadir Yasser Abu Maghsab, 15 years old.
طلال سعدي محمود العسلي, 48 years old. أحمد الجعبري, 50 years old. صقر يوسف خليل بلبل, 57 years old. طارق عوني مصطفى حجيلة, 40 years old. زكي سعيد محمد قدادة, 42 years old. أحمد محمد جدوع أبو جلال, 43 years old. عطية عبد الله مبارك, 57 years old. أمين زهد إبراهيم بشير, 41 years old. رشيد عليان عطية أبو عمرة, 51 years old. عائد صبري محمد راضي, 48 years old.
Tamer Khalil Hemri, 26 years old. Hussam Hussein Abu Shawish, 37 years old. Tamer Rushdi Bashir, 31 years old. Ramadan Ahmad Mahmoud, 24 years old. Amin Ramadan Al-Malahi, 24 years old. Muhammad Zidan Bale, 25 years old. Ibrahim Mahmoud Al-Hawajri, 25 years old. Arkan Harbi Abu Kmail, 24 years old. Mahmoud Rizq Al-Zahar, 13 years old. Mahmoud Abd Rabbu Badr, 24 years old. Hassan Yusuf Al-Ustaz, 22 years old. Muhammad Ahmad Abu Sitta, 21 years old. Mubarak Ahmad Abu Ghula, 24 years old. Rami Abd Rabbu Ubaid, 26 years old.
Samahir Khalil Qdaih, 28 years old. Yusra Basil Shawa, 18 years old. Nisma Hilmi Abu Zur, 21 years old.
Khalil Ibrahim Abdul Aziz Hata, 55 years old. Muhammad Salam Abu Atawi, 36 years old. Ibrahim Muhammad Sliman Al-Astal, 46 years old. Muhammad Khalil Ahmad Tulba, 46 years old. Mukhlis Muhammad Hashim Adwan, 36 years old.
Rami Abd Rabbu Ubaid, 13 years old. Saeed Maher Abu Kmail, 26 years old. Nidal Mahmoud Hassan, 32 years old.
Hassan Abdul Jawad, 32 years old.
Osama Walid Ibrahim Shhada, 17 years old. Iyad Yusuf Ahmad Abu Khusa, 1 years old. Abdul Rahman Majdi Ramadan Naim, 5 years old. Mahmoud Atiya Abdul Razzaq Abu Khusa, 13 years old. Muhammad Ibrahim Rizq Ashur, 8 years old. Mahmoud Rizq Kilani Ashur, 8 years old. Muhammad Iyad Fuad Abu Zur, 5 years old.
Ahmad Maher Abu Kmail, 23 years old. Ahmad Ismail Abu Msameh, 13 years old. Habis Hassan Awad Msammah, 26 years old. Wa'ir Haid Al-Ghalban, 26 years old. Hisham Muhammad Al-Ghalban, 26 years old. Ismail Khattab Omar Gandil, 23 years old. Mahmoud Saeed Sulaiman Abu Khater, 34 years old. Abdullah Harb Salim Abu Khater, 21 years old. Ahmad Usama Al-Atrash, 24 years old. Muhammad Saleh Al-Lolahi, 24 years old.
Sahar Fadi Abu Zur, 21 years old. Raneen Jamal Addalu, 22 years old. Samah Abdul Hamid Addalu, 27 years old. Hiba Adil Mashharawi, 19 years old. Tahrir Ziyad Al-Bahri, 22 years old.
Abdul Rahman Salim Samar Al-Masri, 23 years old. Awad Hamdin Nahal, 31 years old. Usama Yusuf Al-Qadi, 26 years old. Saifuddin Sulaiman Sadiq, 27 years old. Hussam Ad-Din Ibrahim Al-Zaini, 30 years old. Muhammad Tawfiq Al-Nasasra, 18 years old. Ahmad Abed Abu Umar, 24 years old. Khalid Abed Abu Umar, 20 years old.
Ibrahim Muhammad Jamal Ad-Dalo, 1 year old. Yusuf Muhammad Jamal Ad-Dalo, 4 years old. Jamal Muhammad Jamal Ad-Dalo, 6 years old. Omar Jihad Al-Mashharawi, 11 months old. Saib Fuad Khalil Hijazi, 2 years old. Muhammad Fuad Khalil Hijazi, 4 years old. Hussein Jalal Muhammad Nasser, 6 years old. Ashur Suhail Ashur Hamada, 10 years old. Tamir Salama Ibrahim Isrifan, 3 years old. Faris Ahmad Diab Al-Basyuni, 8 years old. Uday Jamal Abdul Karim Nasir, 15 years old.
Mahmoud Al-Komi, 28 years old. Hussam Salama, 30 years old. Muhammad Abu Aisha, 24 years old.
Abir Talal Saadi Asali, 12 years old. Tasneem Zuhair Muhammad Nuhal, 10 years old. Sara Muhammad Jamal Ad-Dalo, 9 years old. Yara Jamal Mahmoud Ad-Dalo, 17 years old. Riham Mahir Nabihin, 3 years old. Amira Ahmad Ibrahim Abu Nasser, 15 years old.
Shawgi Sulaiman Silmi Abu Snema, 28 years old. Muhammad Kamil Abu Udwan, 18 years old. Abdul Rahman Talat Ahmad Ibrahim Hussein, 18 years old.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تحسبن الذين قتلوا في سبيل الله أمواتا بل أحياء عند ربهم يرزقون صدق الله العظيم.
With its military, the fourth most powerful in the world, Israel used incredible force against one of the most densely populated places on earth. Doctors found toxic shrapnel in the bodies of little children. Israel's use of force constituted a deliberate policy of state terrorism inflicted recklessly on a largely defenseless third world, oppressed, historically displaced population. All here suffer from some sort of psychological scarring. To the Western world, these names represent some sort of collateral damage. While they are not war casualties, and these deaths will never be erased from our consciences, millions of people will tirelessly seek justice in their names.
For almost all of my life, I have been deeply involved in the Palestinian struggle. I talked earlier about the siege-breaking convoys and so on that we took through the lines of dictatorship and Zionist siege into the relief of the people of Gaza. I've been traveling in Palestine for almost 35 years. I've been with the Palestinians for almost 40 years. And I'm never going to give up that cause, even though I now find myself actually not very well with the prevailing trends within Palestinian society. The ruling elite in Ramallah and the West Bank under the president Mahmoud Abbas don't like me because they think that over the last years that I've been concentrating on Gaza, that I've been too close to the other resistance organizations, principally Hamas. Hamas don't like me because of my stand against their friends in the so-called Syrian revolution, my attitude in Egypt, and so on. So I'm not actually on talking terms now with either of the main Palestinian political organizations. That's just the way it is. But my fidelity to the Palestinian cause, the right of the Palestinian people to return to their homes and their land, and my opposition to the apartheid state of Israel will never end until these situations have been resolved. And if my breath runs out before that has been achieved, I pray that my sons will continue that struggle until Palestine is free, Arab, and dignified. The Palestinian people as a whole have certainly never let any of us down. Their fortitude, their fidelity to their cause, their bravery, their sense of sacrifice, their ability and willingness to endlessly sacrifice in order to obtain and achieve justice is a heroic example, the likes of which I think the world has rarely seen. And of all the suffering people in Palestine, whether in exile outside in refugee camps or scattered around the world or living under occupation and bisection by settlement and military checkpoint in the West Bank, or under annexation in the Golan Heights or in Jerusalem itself, none of the Palestinians have had to suffer as much as the Palestinians trapped inside Gaza, 80% of whom are refugees who are not from Gaza in the first place, 80% of nearly 2 million people who have lived under now a punitive siege of medieval proportions, which has slowly starved their children, in many cases to death, to punish them for having voted in a democratic election for a party, Hamas, which the West and Israel don't like. I don't like them much myself, but I've always been clear that the only people entitled to choose the leadership of the Palestinian people are the Palestinians themselves, and not their tormentors, not their occupiers, or those who make that occupation and that tormenting possible. The people of Gaza have suffered many invasions and attacks, but 2012 saw yet another one. Just a few years after Operation Cast Lead, which had lasted 22 days and which killed and maimed thousands of Palestinians, it all happened all over again in 2012. Israel broke the tacit ceasefire which existed between the main fighting organizations on the Palestinian side and the State of Israel, began again its policy of brute, crude, bloody assassination of Palestinian leaders, and guaranteed another round of fighting in which many thousands of people were again affected. Most of those who were killed were women and children. Almost none of those who were killed were fighters. Hamas was not broken. The Palestinian resistance organizations were not broken. All that was broken were the hearts, the lives of families living under siege in Gaza, amongst the rubble and the squalor which already existed there. Israel has been spending freely its political capital ever since 1982 and the massacre of the Palestinian refugees at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut. Israel has been spending and spending and spending like there was no tomorrow, spending its political capital, which is now very definitely in a very big overdraft. And they drew on that overdraft still further in the 2012 war against the people of Gaza. Everyone now can see the truth, even those who have an interest in continuing to deny it. Only the most hardened Zionist sympathizer was with Israel in that war. Even the states like my own, Great Britain, which has interests in defending Israel and supporting Israel, could only do so with a heavy heart because they knew that public opinion in this country has moved decisively. It's one of the joys of my life that when I started out on the Palestinian cause in the midsummer of 1975, you could have fitted all the supporters of the PLO as it then was into this house comfortably with an elephant or two to fill in the vacant spaces. But now the vast majority of people in Britain know that the principal reason for the trouble in the Middle East and therefore the wider world is the injustice that has been suffered by the Palestinian people. And so the British government had to act as if it were supporting Israel with the heaviest of heart and studded with caveats and excuses for what Israel was doing. One thing you can predict for 2013 is that the bloodlust of the Zionist leadership has not been sated, but you can also count on this, that the Palestinian people will never surrender. They've come too far, sacrificed too much, paid too high a price, ever to accept their intended fate as an ex-nation in the museum of ex-nations. The Palestinians will continue to resist. I hope that they will reunite the political center of the Palestinian people, inside and outside Palestine. I hope that the victory in the United Nations over recognition is a step in the right direction. I believe that the defeat of the 2012 Israeli aggression against the Palestinians in Gaza is another step in the right direction. Of one thing I am sure: colonialism can never prevail forever. Empires always fall. The United States empire is already visibly crumbling in front of our eyes. The imperial countries are on the economic floor, and no matter how much hardware they still have, their soft power is draining away visibly in front of us. And when the last man standing in this conflict, that last man will be a Palestinian. Palestine will be free. Not in 2013, maybe not in 2023, but one day, soon, Palestine will be free, and Israel as we know it, as an apartheid Zionist state, will be no more. Just a couple of domestic things I wanted to add. In this house, it turned out, a very senior police officer was roaming free. I have no idea what he was doing in my house. Neither do the Metropolitan Police. The police officer is under arrest, bailed to return in 2013. He was a commander of the anti-terrorist unit, though he was not acting on their behalf when he was here in my house. It turns out that he was setting up fake email accounts which were then used to damage me and my party respect in relation to national newspapers. More fool them who thought they were corresponding with any old Billy or Dan, but were in fact corresponding on an email account set up by a senior commander in the anti-terrorism branch of the Metropolitan Police. I mention it only because of this. In the same year of 2012, another senior police officer was arrested and bailed, following in this case a successful effort to force the resignation from the cabinet, the government of Great Britain itself. Andrew Mitchell, the erstwhile chief whip of the Tory government, is no friend of mine. But it can never be right in any country, let alone a country that calls itself a democracy, for the police to be out of control, for police officers to be able routinely to break the law, for police officers to be able to subvert the political lives of elected politicians. Yet that happened twice in London in 2012, and I asked the question, just what's going on at Scotland Yard? Just what's going on at the Metropolitan Police? If these two rogue police officers were acting of their own volition, as the police say they were, and personally I believe them, then who were they working for? What kind of men do we have in these senior positions in the Metropolitan Police who can act as freelance operatives, dabbling in the internal democracy of the country? I don't know the answer to these questions. I'm just pointing out that the answers to them better come in 2013. I wish all of you a happy and healthy new year. In particular, I wish for President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela a return to health, because the Venezuelan revolution needs you, and the peoples of Latin America need you. The people of the world need to see President Chavez restored to health, God willing. I hope you'll stick with the Malacca Red channel. You can also follow on Twitter at George Galloway. You can follow on Facebook, George Galloway MP. And we also have a journal where there's some half-decent writing and some very good photographs. I can say that because they're taken by my missus, on malaccared@wordpress.com. So, the very best to you and your loved ones in 2013. If God spares me, I'll continue the struggle as I've done for rather a long time now, until we meet again. This has been George Galloway. This has been Good Night with George Galloway, and it's good night to you.